You sit before me, listening with that quiet alertness that only an empath carries. And I can sense, even now, the subtle tremor in your inner world. You have lived long in a realm where feeling is not merely an experience, but an atmosphere that surrounds you, permeates you, shapes the way your psyche absorbs reality. And it is precisely because of that sensitivity, so often mistaken as fragility, that you stand today on the threshold of a transformation few understand, fewer anticipate, and almost no one can truly interpret except those who have lived inside the hidden corridors of the psyche. The empath is about to step into the greatest comeback of their life, not because the world finally becomes kinder, but because the empath finally becomes sovereign over the world within. There is a strange paradox in the life of an empath. You have carried for years or decades an intuitive knowing that you were meant for something more expansive than the quiet suffering you endured. Yet every time you attempted to rise, it was as though something ancient in your unconscious pulled you back into an invisible pattern. This is not coincidence. This is not weakness. This is the psyche calling you into deeper waters. For the empath's greatest comeback does not begin with triumph, it begins with descent. It begins in the underworld, where your abandoned emotions, your unspoken truths, your forgotten selves all live as if trapped in dreamlike figures waiting to be acknowledged. You must understand something essential. The unconscious is not a passive reservoir. It is a realm of living realities, archetypal energies, symbols that have formed the architecture of your inner world since the earliest moments of your existence. When an empath suppresses their own emotional truth, the unconscious does not dissolve. It swells, expands, waits, and then pushes back. It sends messages through dreams, through unexpected triggers, through the repeated patterns of relationships that challenge your boundaries, as if the psyche itself insists on your evolution. Many empaths believe they must rise by being even more gentle, more giving, more understanding. But the comeback of the empath begins when you stop identifying with the wounded child within you who needed to overextend, overfeel, and overabsorb to survive. There is a moment when the psyche demands a shift from identification to awareness. Instead of saying, I am the wound, the empath begins to say, I am the one who observes the wound. This shift seems subtle, but it is seismic. In that moment, the empath begins to walk out of the old myth they inherited and begins to author their own. If you pay close attention to your dreams, you will notice that they have been preparing you for this. Perhaps you have dreamt in recent months of dark forests, of abandoned houses, of forgotten rooms inside old buildings, symbols of the unconscious inviting you inward. Perhaps a shadowy figure has appeared, not to harm you, but to challenge the innocence you use as a shield. The empath's shadow is not aggression or cruelty. The empath's shadow is self-betrayal. It is the refusal to speak your truth for fear of hurting others. It is the fear of being disliked. It is the compulsive need to maintain harmony even when disharmony is the medicine required for the next stage of your life. In one of my patients' dreams many years ago, a woman found herself standing before a vast sea. The waters were calm, yet she felt an overwhelming fear. When she approached the edge, the sea parted slightly, revealing a staircase descending into the dark depths. She woke terrified but deeply moved. When we explored the symbolism, it became clear the sea was her unconscious, calling her downward. Her greatest transformation did not come from learning how to swim on the surface. It came from allowing herself to descend into the depths, to meet the forgotten parts of her psyche. You, too, stand before such a symbolic sea. You are being invited not to escape your emotional sensitivity, but to reclaim it, to retrieve from the unconscious the parts of yourself that you left behind when the world taught you that feeling deeply was a burden. But feeling deeply is not a burden. It is a compass. It points to truths others cannot perceive. Yet a compass is only useful when the one who holds it knows where they are going. I want you to consider something. Every empath's comeback begins with a moment of inner rebellion. Not rebellion against the world, but rebellion against the internalized expectations that have kept you small. When the empath reaches the point where they can no longer endure carrying the emotional weight of everyone around them, something awakens. A fire they did not know existed begins to rise. It is not anger. It is not vengeance. It is psychological differentiation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are instead of who you were trained to be. This psychological differentiation is what frees the empath from the archetype of the martyr. You are not here to bleed for the world. You are here to understand it. And in understanding it, you illuminate it. But illumination cannot be given while you are drowning. For years you have attempted to shine while submerged, and you wondered why your light was dim, why your energy depleted, why your relationships drained you. The greatest comeback begins the moment you stop trying to illuminate others and turn inward to illuminate yourself. Some of you may feel a tension building within, as if something immense is approaching from the depths of your unconscious. You may feel restless, unsettled, aware of an invisible pressure surrounding you. This is not anxiety in its ordinary sense. This is the psyche gathering energy for metamorphosis. Before a breakthrough, there is always a build-up. Before clarity, there is always chaos. Before illumination, there is always a period of disorientation where the old identity dissolves, but the new one has not yet appeared. This in-between state is one of the most psychologically sacred phases of the empath's life. It is the liminal threshold where the old self dies, but the new one has not been born. And many empaths fear this phase because it feels as though everything is falling apart. But in truth, it is everything falling into place, just not according to the ego's timeline. The ego wants clarity before surrender, but the psyche demands surrender before clarity. When you feel the pull to withdraw, to isolate, to step away from noise and superficiality, it is because the psyche is reorganizing itself. The empath's comeback requires this withdrawal, not as an escape, but as a recalibration. When the empath withdraws consciously, something extraordinary happens. The unconscious begins to speak more clearly. Symbols sharpen, dreams intensify. Old wounds rise, not to torment you, but to be witnessed and integrated. This is the sacred alchemy of the empath, the transmutation of emotional pain into psychological wisdom. I want to speak now about the archetype that governs this phase of your life, the wounded healer. Many empaths believe this archetype defines their entire destiny. They assume they are meant to heal endlessly from their own suffering so they might heal others. But this archetype, if misunderstood, becomes a prison. The true wounded healer does not identify with their wound. They recognize it as a portal. Your wound is not your identity. It is your initiation. It is the doorway through which you walk into a larger, more expanded version of yourself. The empath is not rising because the world has changed. The empath is rising because they have changed They have reached the psychological threshold where the unconscious no longer tolerates old patterns of self-abandonment. And the unconscious, once awakened, does not retreat. It insists, it demands, it pushes you toward the life you were always meant to live. You may feel a strange momentum building beneath your quiet exterior. You may sense that even though everything looks the same on the outside, something is shifting inside, a tectonic movement of the psyche. This is not imagination. This is the unconscious preparing to surface. Just as an earthquake releases pressure that has built unseen for years, your psyche is preparing to release a lifetime of suppressed power. The empath's greatest comeback is not external success or recognition. It is internal sovereignty. It is the moment you stop abandoning yourself. It is the moment you begin choosing yourself intuitively, instinctively, without guilt or justification. It is the moment the unconscious entrusts you with a power you did not know you possessed because you were too busy protecting others from their own shadows. But now the shadow calls you inward, not to harm you, but to empower you. Every comeback begins with shadow confrontation. Not the shadow of others, the shadow of the empath. The shadow where your voice, your needs, your boundaries, your truth were buried. When you face this shadow, you will feel something you have long forgotten, the sensation of returning home to yourself. And that is where the comeback truly begins. As we continue this journey, I want you to feel the subtle tremor that moves beneath the surface of your consciousness. For an empath, this tremor is not merely emotional, it is archetypal. It signals that something ancient within you is awakening, unfolding, stretching its limbs after a long sleep. The greatest comeback of your life does not arrive with fanfare or grandiosity. It arrives quietly, like a whisper rising from the depths of your inner world, a whisper that says, now, finally, you must return to your own center. And this return is a psychological event far more profound than you may realize. Do not mistake what is happening to you as simple change. This is not a shift of preference, mood, or circumstance. This is metamorphosis of identity. The empath has lived for years inside a pattern that was never truly theirs. You shaped yourself around the emotional landscapes of others, adapting and bending until your own contours became faint outlines. But when the unconscious decides the time of return has come, no force on earth can keep you in that diminished shape. The psyche begins to reconfigure itself, and the empath is compelled to reclaim every piece of themselves that was handed out in fragments to those who did not know how to value them. You are no longer who you were a year ago, nor even who you were last month. There is an invisible psychological momentum forming around you, a gathering of energies once dissipated. You may feel it as restlessness, as heightened intuition, as deeper dreams, as sudden clarity about relationships and situations that once confused you. The unconscious is pulling you inward because your comeback requires complete internal alignment. Any fragment of you still lost in another person's emotional world must return home. Perhaps you have noticed the surfacing of forgotten memories. This too is not accidental. When the empath is preparing for their greatest rise, the psyche begins to retrieve the lost chapters of your story, not to torment you, but to give you the missing pieces of your own myth. You cannot rise fully without understanding the origins of your suffering. The unconscious is not cruel, it is precise. It brings to the surface exactly what you need to examine, nothing more and nothing less. Many empaths fear these resurfacing emotions, believing they signify regression. But regression is not the same as descent. Regression takes you backward, descent takes you downward into depths, into truths. The comeback of the empath demands depth. You cannot rise without descending into the underworld of your own psyche. Every mythic hero, every seeker of wisdom, every soul destined for transformation must first confront what lies beneath. Listen closely. Your unconscious has been preparing you for this moment long before your conscious mind realized it. The patterns that broke you were not punishments, they were preparations. They taught you the anatomy of manipulation, the architecture of emotional dynamics, the subtle fingerprints of shadow in human behavior. You learned, not through intellect alone, but through embodied experience, how the psyche hides, reveals, distorts, and expresses truth. And though these lessons were painful, they were essential. For the empath is not meant to be naive. The empath is meant to be wise. Wisdom, however, does not arise from comfort. It arises from confrontation, from meeting what you once feared to look at. And now, each time you close your eyes, each time you take a breath, you are meeting yourself again. You are rediscovering what was once silenced. The unconscious is shifting, reorganizing, rebalancing. And the empath begins to feel something extraordinary. A strengthening that does not come from becoming harder, but from becoming more whole. The myth of the empath as fragile is one of the greatest psychological misunderstandings of our time. Sensitivity is not fragility. Sensitivity is perception. It allows you to see the subtle motives beneath words, the emotional currents beneath actions, the hidden truths inside relationships. And yet, this same sensitivity once left you vulnerable to those who lacked self-awareness. But now the archetype is shifting. The wounded healer is evolving into the empowered seer. This evolution does not happen through rage or resentment. It happens through integration. Integration is the alchemical marriage of opposites within the psyche. For years, the empath has lived in the polarity of light, compassion, understanding, empathy, forgiveness. But no one can rise fully without integrating the shadow, self-protection, clarity, boundaries, discernment. These shadow qualities are not negative. They are necessary. They are the sword to your light, the structure to your softness, the backbone to your compassion. Some of you fear your shadow, believing that embracing it will make you cold or unkind. But that fear comes from misunderstanding what the shadow truly is. The shadow is not cruelty, it is potency. It is the energy that allows you to say no without guilt. It is the instinct that tells you when someone's intentions are not aligned with your well-being. It is the fierce intuition that stops you from pouring yourself into people who cannot receive truth. Without your shadow, you cannot rise. Without your light, you cannot heal. The comeback of the empath is born from the union of both. This inner union changes how you move through the world. You may find that you no longer tolerate the patterns you once endured. You may feel an inner resistance to conversations that drain you, to environments that overstimulate you, to relationships that do not honor your depth. This is not you becoming harsh. This is you becoming aligned. The psyche rejects what is no longer energetically compatible with your next chapter. And though it may confuse or even disappoint others, it is not your responsibility to shrink so others can remain comfortable. You are stepping into the stage of your life where your energy becomes selective. This selection is not arrogance, it is protection. For an empath, protection is not a wall, it is a filter. And as that filter strengthens, something remarkable happens. Your intuition sharpens. You begin to feel with clarity and immediacy what once took you months or years to understand. This is the gift that emerges when sensitivity and strength merge. The empath becomes not a sponge but a tuning fork, resonating only with what is true. You may begin to sense synchronicities, the universe speaking to you through symbols, numbers, sudden insights. These are not coincidences, they are the psyche aligning with reality. When the inner world shifts, the outer world responds. You are beginning to see through the veils that once obscured your path. The unconscious is no longer a distant realm, it is rising into consciousness, guiding you, instructing you, revealing what was hidden. Perhaps you have felt a new kind of energy within you, something that feels ancient, almost primordial. This is your archetypal inheritance resurfacing. Every empath carries an inner lineage of healers, mystics, seekers, sages, not genetically, but psychologically. Your soul carries the memory of every emotional truth you have ever lived, in every lifetime, in every chapter of your existence. And now that inheritance is awakening because you are finally ready to carry it with clarity instead of confusion. When an empath finally stops abandoning themselves, the psyche begins to reveal its most powerful secrets. You begin to understand why you had to suffer the way you did. You begin to see the purpose behind your wounds, not in a moral sense, but in a psychological one. The wound was not punishment. It was the portal through which your deeper self could emerge. Without that wound, you would have remained asleep to your own nature. You would have mistaken kindness for weakness, intuition for anxiety, boundaries for selfishness. But now these distortions are dissolving. Your psyche is correcting its internal map. You are learning, perhaps for the first time, where you end and the world begins. And as this clarity sharpens, your energy begins to return to you. The empath's greatest comeback is not about rebuilding what was lost. It is about reclaiming what was given away. Imagine your psyche as a great tree. For years, others plucked the fruit, your emotional labor, your patience, your compassion, while the tree received little nourishment in return. But now the roots are strengthening, the trunk is thickening, the branches are rising toward the sky with a new dignity. This is not narcissism, it is natural growth. The tree is no longer trying to survive for others, it is finally learning to flourish for itself. And as it flourishes, it will bear fruit again, but this time from abundance, not depletion. You may begin to feel something that once felt foreign, self-trust. Not the fragile kind built on external validation, but the deep psychological trust that arises when the conscious and unconscious mind begin to work together. This trust is the backbone of your comeback. When you trust yourself, you no longer fear losing others. When you trust yourself, you no longer seek approval to guide your decisions. When you trust yourself, the world cannot manipulate you through guilt, fear, or obligation. This is the inner sovereignty I spoke of. And once sovereignty begins, it cannot be undone. Soon you will feel the shift in your relationships. Some will drift away, not because you push them, but because your energy no longer feeds their patterns. Others will be drawn to you with new respect, sensing the change in your presence. And those who are meant for the next chapter of your life will meet you at the level of your new boundaries, not your old wounds. This is the silent power of psychological transformation. And so the empath stands at the doorway of their greatest comeback, not a return to who you were, but a return to who you were always meant to become. As we move deeper into this unfolding transformation, you may sense a strange duality rising within you. On one hand, there is a profound stillness, a silence that feels almost sacred, as though some intuitive part of your psyche is holding its breath, preparing. On the other hand, there is an unmistakable stirring, a gathering of energy that feels both unfamiliar and inevitable. This paradox is not a contradiction. It is the very essence of psychological rebirth. Before the empath steps into the greatest comeback of their life, the psyche must first create a space where the old dissolves and the new can emerge. The empath is entering a phase where external noise no longer holds the same authority it once did. You may notice that opinions, judgments, and emotional turbulence from others feel more distant, almost as though your psyche has erected a subtle interior wall, not a barrier of coldness, but a boundary of clarity. This is not accidental. When the unconscious decides that the empath is ready to embody a new identity, it naturally withdraws their emotional energy from external attachments so that inner resources can be reallocated for transformation. This withdrawal may feel disorienting at times. People who once occupied large spaces in your mind may suddenly feel emotionally irrelevant. Situations that once triggered deep reactions may no longer stir you. This is not numbness. It is differentiation, the essential process through which the self becomes separate from the projections, energies, and expectations that once entangled you. Without differentiation, there can be no comeback, because the self cannot rise while fused with the emotional worlds of others. This developmental shift is similar to what I observed in individuals going through profound individuation. The psyche slowly separates the gold from the lead, the essential from the inessential, the self from the shadows of others. For the empath, this process has a unique quality. You have spent a lifetime merging with emotional atmospheres, absorbing moods, reading subtle cues, intertwining with the psychological realities of those around you. But now, that ability is being recalibrated. You are learning to feel without absorbing, to sense without merging, to understand without losing yourself. This is one of the most powerful shifts in the empath's journey, the transformation from emotional fusion to intuitive sovereignty. Many empaths mistakenly believe that the intensity of their feelings is what makes them compassionate. But compassion is not the collapse of boundaries, it is the expansion of awareness. True compassion emerges when you can perceive another's suffering without drowning in it. And this clarity is the foundation upon which your comeback will be built. This newfound clarity also illuminates the emotional patterns that previously held you captive. You may begin to recognize with a kind of shocking precision how your wounds shaped your choices. You may see how certain relationships were not coincidences, but mirrors, psychological theaters, where unresolved parts of your unconscious played out their stories. Some mirrors reflected your caretaking tendencies. Others reflected your fear of abandonment. Others still reflected the silent belief that love must be earned through sacrifice. But now the mirrors are cracking. You are starting to see through them, beyond them. You are beginning to understand that your sensitivity was never meant to bind you to pain. It was meant to guide you to self-realization. This shift from entanglement to awareness is the turning point where the empath begins to reclaim their narrative. There is a dream motif common among empaths undergoing transformation, the dream of walking through a familiar place that suddenly becomes unfamiliar. A hallway shifts, a door appears where none existed, a familiar person speaks in a voice that is not their own. These dreams announce the restructuring of the psyche. The unconscious is rearranging its internal architecture, preparing for a new version of you to take form. One patient once dreamt that she was standing in a room she knew from childhood, but the furniture had been rearranged. At first, she panicked, believing she was losing her grounding. But when we explored the symbolism, the message became clear. The past was being reinterpreted through a new psychological lens. She was no longer the powerless child in that room. She was the observer. And the observer has power the child never had access to. You, too, are becoming the observer of your own myth. This shift in perspective is what frees the empath from the cycle of repetition. When you stop reliving your story and begin witnessing it, the unconscious can no longer use the old narrative to dictate your future. And so the comeback begins not with new outward actions, but with the emergence of a new inner identity. This identity is characterized by something the empath has rarely experienced: calm power. Not the power that dominates, manipulates, or conquers, but the power that simply is a presence rooted in truth, awareness, and integration. When an empath begins to embody this kind of power, the world around them responds differently. People can feel the change, even if they cannot articulate it. The empath no longer radiates the energy of someone who can be easily influenced or emotionally pulled off center. Instead, you emanate a balanced energy that signals psychological maturity. This transformation may surprise you. You may catch yourself speaking more directly without the elaborate cushioning you once needed to soften every truth. You may begin to say no instinctively, without rehearsing the reasons. You may find yourself listening to your body, your intuition, your dreams with a seriousness you never gave them before. These are not random behavioral shifts. They are the manifestation of an internal reorganization long in the making. At a deeper level, your shadow is integrating. The empath shadow often contains the parts of you that learn to be silent, invisible, accommodating. But now these shadow aspects are merging with your conscious self, bringing with them the very strengths you once lacked: assertiveness, clarity, boundaries, and self-authority. Psychological integration replaces emotional fragmentation, and the empath becomes whole. Wholeness changes everything. When you become whole, you no longer attract relationships defined by imbalance. You no longer tolerate environments that require you to shrink. You no longer mistake intensity for connection or sacrifice for love. This clarity is not learned. It emerges spontaneously when the psyche reaches coherence. And this coherence is the heartbeat of your comeback. You may notice that as you rise into this new identity, some individuals in your life respond with confusion, resistance, or even hostility. This is because your transformation disrupts the unconscious contracts they once relied upon. Those who benefited from your emotional labor may feel threatened by your boundaries. Those who used your sensitivity to avoid their own shadows may feel exposed. And those who mistook your empathy for weakness may struggle to understand your newfound strength. Do not let this deter you. This resistance is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is proof that you are evolving. When the empath steps into their power, the psychological ecosystem around them must recalibrate. Some people will rise with you, others will fall away. This is the nature of transformation. You may feel grief in this phase, grief for the self you once were, for the relationships you once believed in, for the emotional landscapes you once navigated with devotion. But grief is not regression. Grief is the soul honoring what no longer belongs to it. Let the grief pass through you like a tide. Do not cling to it. It is clearing space for a new chapter of your identity to emerge. Soon you will begin to feel a pull, a sense of inward acceleration, as though you are being drawn into a deeper alignment with your purpose. This pull is not external ambition, it is psychological destiny. The empath's greatest comeback is not merely personal. It is archetypal. It is the moment when you become the vessel for a wisdom larger than your individual history. You begin to move differently, see differently, feel differently. You no longer live from reaction, you live from intuition. You no longer live from fear, you live from depth. And that depth carries with it a kind of quiet authority the world cannot ignore. Something else begins to happen as this authority expands. The empath's perception shifts from horizontal to vertical. Horizontally, you once absorbed everything around you, people's moods, fears, and unspoken needs. But vertically, you begin to draw from a deeper source, an inner well that feels ancient, steady, and inexhaustible. This vertical connection is what mystics have spoken of throughout the ages, a connection to the self, the true center of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness itself. When the empath begins to align with the self, life ceases to be a cycle of emotional survival. It becomes a journey of meaning. The signs become clearer. The archetypes become more vivid. The dreams become more instructive. And the path ahead becomes illuminated not by logic, but by inner knowing. This is the rebirth. This is the threshold. This is the moment where the empath stops viewing life through the lens of their wounds and begins to view it through the lens of their potential. You are not merely preparing for a comeback, you are preparing for an emergence. And the emergence of the empath is one of the most powerful psychological events a human being can undergo. Everything in your psyche is aligning. The unconscious is rising. The old self is dissolving. The new self is forming. You are stepping forward, not back into the greatest chapter of your existence. As we enter the final movement of this exploration, you may begin to sense that everything in your inner world has been slowly guiding you toward this point. The empath's greatest comeback is never a sudden event. It is a culmination, a gathering of symbols, shadows, wounds, lessons, insights, and quiet moments of truth that coalesce into a new form of psychological being. And now, at this threshold, the empath stands face to face with the destiny they long avoided, yet always carried within them. There is a profound shift that occurs when the empath finally stops negotiating with their own pain. For years, perhaps decades, you treated your suffering as something to manage, accommodate, or endure. You believed that if you simply kept giving, kept understanding, kept forgiving, the world would soften, but the world does not soften through sacrifice. The world softens through awareness. And awareness does not bloom through submission. It blooms through alignment. Alignment is the state in which everything within you points in the same direction. Your intuition, your instincts, your boundaries, your desires, your truth. When the empath reaches alignment, the inner fracture that once split your psyche into what I feel versus what others need begins to heal. The two halves merge into a singular, coherent identity, and in that coherence, your energy returns to you, like a tide coming home. Many empaths experience this moment as a surge of strength that feels almost otherworldly. You may find yourself speaking with a clarity that surprises even you. You may feel a boldness rising through your spine, not aggressive but immovable. It is the boldness of someone who has finally remembered their own center. This is not the center that reacts to others. It is the center that acts from truth. Your unconscious has been preparing you for this emergence through every challenge you faced. When you were torn apart emotionally, the psyche was revealing the places where your boundaries needed reinforcement. When you were drained, the psyche was showing you the cost of abandoning yourself. When you were disappointed, the psyche was dismantling old illusions that no longer served your evolution. Every experience was a symbolic teaching, guiding you step by step toward individuation.